Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and patch 11.2 is bringing with it a brand new set of tier sets for all of our classes, which all come in with substantial power increases, but also they come in with some of the most amount of flavor and creativity and freedom of choice than ever before. Previously, our tier sets would just give us a very specific bonus, and we were forced to pick talents and play around that bonus, but this time around, Blizzard is letting you make the choice by letting you choose between two different tier sets per spec, one for every hero talent that is connected to your playstyle. Recently on the channel, we started to take a look at these tier sets bit by bit, class by class, and I wanted to move on to the class of Mage, which probably got the most amount of flavor, especially when you take a look at playstyles such as Sun Fury and Frostfire, which has got so many cool elements that really do lean into their identities, one of someone in a powerful phoenix who grants you unimaginable strength, while the other allows you to merge frost and fire together. Then of course we have the Spellslinger, and we have a little bit of talk about when it comes to that hero spec specifically. But as always, if you guys want to see more regular class updates for the patch 11.2 PTR, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. It feels like some of these tier sets that they cooked up, however, for 11.2 do have like a ton of cool thematic components that help emphasize this playstyles. And I want to start out with the Frost Mage, specifically when going over the tier set for the Frostfire, which is shared by, aptly named, Frost and Fire specs. So the Frostfire 2 set reads: Meteor, Frostfire Burst, and Frostfire Bolt deal 10% more damage, and now apply Ignite, dealing an additional 30% damage over 9 seconds. Now, Ignite is a Fire Mage mechanic. However, we're in a spec of Frost, so Frost Mages have access to Ignite, a Fire Mage mastery, but now transformed as just like a tier set bonus. To me, it is actually kind of wild how this is a mechanic. I don't hate it, I actually kind of love it. Thematically, it's really cool, and that's some sort of a damage component that they can also tune going forward, but it's just kind of weird to me how they could just take a core thing of fire and just give it to Frost to a tier set, and I absolutely love that synergetic feel. But we don't stop there, as we do still have the 4 set. Casting Glacial Spike has a 100% chance to also cast a Pyroblast, dealing 1 million damage to the target. Additionally, Pyroblast now benefits from Ignite. So as you build up your alliances, or icicles rather, against the target, eventually you can cast a full-on Glacial Spike, and that will also now Pyroblast at the target as well. You also saw something interesting there. I didn't just send one Pyroblast, I sent 2 of them, because I sent 2 Glacial Spikes at the same time because of the Cleaving Talent Splitting Ice, which causes a portion of another Glacial Spike, or actually 100% of the damage of the Glacial Spike, to hit a secondary target. So this ends up applying for your Pyroblast as well. I think that's really cool how they were able to tie that ability directly with Glacial Spike in that way. Those Pyroblasts also do help contribute towards Ignite damage. Numerically, everything is still up in the air, but thematically, I think it's a really cool tier set that's for the most part very passive, just grants you additional bonuses. It does make you want to play into Glacial Spike as a talent. That's really about all it does here, but outside of that, it does give you quite a bit of freedom of how you can customize your talent tree. Now, the Fire Mage version of this, the 2 set reads: Common Storm, Frostfire Bolt, and Frostfire Burst deal additional damage, and now apply Ignite at 150% effectiveness, so now you have those Frost abilities contribute towards your Ignite on top of your Fire abilities as well. This also helps reinforce Ignite damage just a little bit more, and allows you to lean heavier into Ignite, which Fire Mages have a way to do directly, either by buffing their mastery or picking certain other talents that help amplify that Ignite damage. Casting Pyroblast has a 20% chance to also class a Glacial Spike, dealing roughly 1 million damage to your target. Glacial Spike cast this way don't root the target like Frost Mages do, however they also now benefit from Ignite. For Fire Mages, however, the whole Ignite mechanic, or rather Pyroblast spamming with Glacial Spikes, for them it's a little bit all over the place because they can just cast a bunch of Pyroblasts. So even given a 20% chance to proc, I think they're trying to make it about as like consistent in terms of uptime of how many Glacial Spikes you can send out to like the Pyroblast as a Frost Mage, because you're not able to spam Glacial Spikes. You could use them every so often. So I think they're just trying to give you Glacial Spikes every so often as a Fire Mage. But I actually think the damage of the ability itself, the fact that it can crit and how much damage it can do, I mean, it can hit harder than a Pyroblast, which is interesting, and I wonder if it's going to be tuned like this on purpose. The tooltip, however, doesn't quite reflect the damage. It says it's about 1 million, so it is hitting for not even 1 million, actually almost 5 times that, if anything. I'm not really sure what the math is here, however, I am also hitting these train dummies, which do take slightly more damage, but this is one of those interesting mechanics that I kind of love, actually. Just like the Frostmage version, it's a very passive tier set that just helps add additional damage amplifications to certain casts and effects. It doesn't necessarily change up your talent build too heavily or doesn't encourage you to play one playstyle or another, but I do like how it's able to thematically add the frosty elements into that Fire Mage gameplay. I would have loved to see the 2 set, or the 4 set rather, get some kind of consistency to it, so instead of having like a 20% chance to also cast Glacial Spike, I would have loved to have it maybe do a every 3, 4, or 5 Pyroblast you also cast a Glacial Spike, just so there was just that guaranteed consistency, because I feel like sometimes you can get very, very unlucky or very lucky, so it'd be nice to have some kind of like a bad luck protection out of this ability specifically. From there, though, we get to move on to another Fire Mage hero spec of the Sun Fury, which is the Phoenix playstyle. It's very straightforward. You get these orbs of Spellfire Spheres, which you'll either conjure naturally before a pull or during combat. Then every time you pop your major cooldowns like Combustion or Arcane Surge, you'll cast Memory, or you'll actually summon a Phoenix that eventually grants you the ability of Memory of Alar. So this one is really straightforward for the most part, even more passive than Frostfire, but what's interesting about it is just how much burst that it offers, as the Phoenix playstyle always was like something that had heavy burst damage, especially towards the tail end after the Phoenix vanishes, and it looks like that has been reinforced even more this time around. 2 set reads: Spellfire Spheres damage bonus is increased by 2%, so you get even more damage in from every Spellfire Sphere, and in 5 stacks you look at a 15% additional damage, which is pretty solid. Mana Cascade now grants an additional 0.5 haste per stack. Mana Cascade being talent here, consuming Hot Streak as a Fire Mage grants you 1% haste for 10 seconds. So it's just going to give you roughly more haste as a stat, which is not a terrible stat at all. Getting more secondary stats in most cases generally can be good. The 4 set, however, is where things get kind of fun. It reads: Exceptional spells cast by your Phoenix adds an additional 1 second to the duration of your next Hyperthermia. When your Phoenix expires, it empowers you even further beyond, granted lesser time warp and 10% increased spell damage for 13 seconds. So now you get a bigger burst window whenever that Phoenix expires, specifically with Memory of Alar, as normally for Fire Mages, after combustion ends, depending on how many Spellfire Spheres Phoenix consumed, is going to grant you Hyperthermia with the duration equal to how many spheres it's able to eat up, which Hyperthermia has actually been buffed up as a talent. Pyroblast and Flame Strike have no casting and are guaranteed to critical strike. Also, they'll now increase the damage of your Pyroblast and Flame Strike by 15% up to 50, which is part of the baseline Hyperthermia talent tree. So now if, let's say, we send out a Phoenix for a bit, let him do all the damage, you'll see that the Phoenix is going to be able to give me a pretty solid duration of Hyperthermia, where I'll be able to spam Pyroblast over and over, and every single one of these Pyroblasts is going to increase the damage every single global. Plus, I also have a slight time warp for 15 additional % worth of haste, where I can just spam one singular ability, building up his damage over and over until I do reach a max stack. I still have a couple of globals to send in during that moment. And you can kind of see just kind of the playstyle that it offers. It's a big burst playstyle of massive combustion, followed by this huge Memory of Alar for Fire Mages to continue pounding the pressure into the target. For the most part itself, the Phoenix does not get any more interactions or become any more complex to use with this tier set. It just gives you a much bigger burst window that follows afterwards, giving you a big bulk of haste and potentially giving you one of the strongest burst windows out there. For Fire Mages, I think it's going to involve you trying to reduce the combustion cooldown as fast as possible, so you most likely are still going to be playing into Unleash Inferno, just so you can have as many Phoenixes available during your overall run. As an Arcane Mage, however, the tier set doesn't really change too much. It just changes what ability is granted by the 4 set. For Arcane Mages, Arcane Soul Memory of Alar is a little different, because instead of letting you channel or cast Pyroblast back to back, you get barrages that will grant you clear casting and generate 4 arcane charges. Each cast of Arcane Barrage increases the damage of your Arcane Barrage by 15% up to 150. So you kind of are almost encouraged to just spam Arcane Barrages as much as possible during that window, but now the window has gotten extended a little bit with that 4 set, plus it grants you additional spell damage and a lesser version of Time Warp, which gives you also a very, very strong burst window. However, for Arcane Mages, what's noted is the actual cooldown of Arcane Surge cannot be reduced like it can be for Fire. So you are kind of stuck with a bit of a limitation as to how often you can use Arcane Surge. It does have a fairly short cooldown since all mages have natural cooldown reduction thanks to shifting power. However, where Fire Mages can actually get very short downtime of combustion and more Phoenixes in a run, Arcane will be kind of limited a little bit by this playstyle. However, even with these limitations, Arcane Mages still will have a ton of extra output thanks to that Phoenix burst damage, which is on its own fairly strong, and giving you that much longer window of an Arcane Soul, it is still highly effective as an ability. It is something that just allows you to spam as many barrages, get you to build up the damage on those barrages, and get you just to absolutely obliterate the target with a ton of output. Like, the barrages themselves deal a lot of damage, and Blizz actually recently has gotten and made a couple of changes to Arcane to further amplify the damage of those barrages by quite a bit. Like, Intuition grants you 50% more damage for barrages, then they ended up buffing up their Mastery to also further amplify the damage of barrages, which can then be further enhanced even better with Prodigious Savant in order to make the Mastery and barrage type of damage a lot better. Plus, there's also an opportunity for this big execute opportunity with Sun Fury's execution, so Arcane Mages could have a significant execute window every time they're able to summon the Phoenix and then barrage the enemy down as much as possible. So for them, potentially, it's probably not going to be more uses of Phoenix, but rather a very strong Phoenix window and potentially significant enough of an execute window where your damage is probably going to spike a lot as soon as the boss drops. What percentage is it? 35%. Whenever your barrage is dealing 130% more damage. This could maybe adjust the stats for Arcane, but just like Fire, the Phoenix itself is pretty standard, it's pretty passive, it just does its own thing and then gives you a buff. How you use that buff doesn't really change too much with the tier set, but it is probably going to be a very strong tier set on its own, especially if the mana values, or rather the values of the tier set, are tuned correctly, as it can give you a significant burst window that continues after your primary burst. So you gotta have this like ramping component or extended burst in a way, which will likely be very strong depending on the content. And from there, we have the hero talent of the Spellslinger, which is a hero spec that has done well in certain situations, but it hasn't been like generally an overall good playstyle. There are some things that they're changing with it for 11.2. One of those things is your ability to reset orbs, whether it's Arcane Orb or Frost Mage Orb. You're going to be able to get cooldown reduction on it with Spell Frost Teachings from direct splinter damage, but you're not going to be able to just immediately reset it anymore. And your tier sets, both of them, partially play into the orb-based gameplay to a small degree. I would say a little bit more towards Frost Mages, but a little bit less for Arcane, though they're still integrated quite a bit with abilities like Splinter and Orbs. The two set reads, Arcane Blast damage is increased by 20%. That is pretty solid, more single target damage. Direct Splinter damage has a 100% chance to grant you a stack of Arcane Harmony. Which is interesting because we have a 2 set that now interacts with the talent of Arcane Harmony, where normally missiles boost the damage of your Arcane Barrage. You want to make sure to gas this ability off as soon as possible. But now when you send out an orb, you send out a couple of splinters, then now all count towards the Arcane Harmony. And if I continue on, let's say, to cast Arcane Blast, and if I can get a clear casting proc at some point, hopefully there goes a good clear casting proc. And as those missiles fly in, they build up towards the Arcane Harmony buff. So now you have more than one way to be able to build Arcane Harmony. Splinter damage is increased by 8%. Arcane Orb has a 100% chance to grant a stack of Arcane Harmony up to 8 times. So now we have the ability of orbs now granting us stacks of Arcane Harmony, and on top of the splinters they generate, also casting us stacks of Arcane Harmony. From there on, we also have, upon reaching maximum stacks of Arcane Harmony, you now gain Intuition. So now you have a talent that once it gets maximum stacks, triggers another talent as a guarantee, which is very interesting all on its own. So as I, let's say, try to build up for splinters, I try to go missiles, I'm trying to be very careful with how many of these harmonies I end up generating, and I think one more orb will do it. 8, 2 more splinters, yeah. As soon as I got 20 stacks of Arcane Harmony, I got Intuition, so the next barrage is now going to grant me full Arcane charges, deal a bunch more damage, and then you refund all of your Arcane charges back, so then you don't need to re-interrupt your rotation. However, this mechanic and playstyle, while I like how it actually interacts with the base kit of Arcane Mage, it's also awkward in many different ways, specifically in single target. Like, maybe this playstyle would be really good but it may need rotational adjustments. Like, take the talent of Arcane Harmony. It's ingrained in most mages that play with this talent to not let it reach 20 stacks. But with your Foresight, you do want to do so to reach Intuition so you can buff the damage of your Barrage and regain those Arcane charges. What feels weird is because Arcane mages, for a while now, has played around with the talent of Arcane Harmony, and in most cases, they try to not let it build up to above 20 stacks, because otherwise you're just wasting stacks. So mages have implored a couple of rotational adjustments where usually in most cases, at least right now, when you see Arcane Harmony at about 13 stacks, it's perfectly fine to send Arcane Barrage immediately, because it's better just to consume those stacks instead of overbuilding them. But now you're going to run a situation where you have to unlearn that learned rotational thing with Harmony and just let it be overbuilt. On top of it now, Splinters attach and apply stacks towards Arcane Harmony, and the Splinters have a heavy delay in when they appear and when they reach the target, and Arcane Harmony will not update its charges until the splinter physically connects to that target. So now you either have an option of, if you are trying to play around 20 charges of Harmony, try not to overdraw on it, it's going to make it that much harder with this kind of delay. Or if now you're going to ignore the stacks until you get a buff of Intuition, and then it just feels like you're playing against what the talent is intended to be, like a balancing act of sorts. So everything about this feels awkward in pure single target. But this is not the end of the world, as soon as you switch the playstyle over to AoE and you start barraging and sending out orbs, and naturally in AoE you may find yourself in a situation where you're overbuilding on Harmony, but there it feels like your playstyle and the actual flow of combat feels a lot more natural. Just because you're hitting so many targets, you're going to overbuild on those charges, and that's okay. Instead, what that overbuilding does is it gives you more procs to then leverage back into sending out more orbs, into sending out more splinters at those targets while barraging enemies, which deals a ton of damage, orbing a lot more often, which now has better cooldown reduction, and this feels so smooth in AoE. It feels like the tier set was almost designed for AoE gameplay, but in single target it feels kind of painfully awkward, and there's many mages out there that feel the same way. I'm actually so glad about it because I was kind of losing my mind trying to figure this out, how to play this in single target, but apparently I'm not the only one. A lot of mages out there have wondered if the tier set is working as intended, as the actual way that it reads, it almost sounds like it grants you the buff of, or the talent of Arcane Harmony without you necessarily having to talent into it, but you still need to talent into it in order to take advantage of it. But then having to make those rotational adjustments in single target to play around it also feels weird. Some mages have suggested that maybe they should add and allow Arcane Harmony to stack beyond 20 stacks, like 30 or 40, but allow you to gain the Intuition buff at 20 stacks, and then there will be some sort of a gameplay flow for this playstyle in general, while also allowing mages to stack quite big barrages for PvE content. That could be made fun in some way, but a lot of players think that this is likely going to get some sort of rework, hopefully in the near future, but the current version just doesn't quite connect with many mages out there. And lastly, we have Spellslinger as a Frost, which isn't a popular combo, at least as of this moment. It was for a little bit, especially in dungeons with the resets for orbs, but now there's a little bit more cooldown reduction passive to it with Spell Frost teachings instead of complete snap resets. I think it's going to end up playing a little bit better. Maybe it'll be overall better. I feel like it's going to play a little bit differently, maybe for better, maybe for worse, but I do miss those snap resets on Frost and Spellslinger because they're just fun to make a bunch of orbs happen at the same time. The tier set reads, the 2 set, Ice Lance and Icicle damage is increased by 20%. Direct Splinter damage has a 25% chance to grant a stack of Cold Front. And Cold Front is a talent right here at the bottom of the capstone, which may likely be the talent it looks like you most likely will have to commit into. Casting 30 Frostbolts or Flurries summons a Frozen Orb that travels towards your target, hitting an enemy player counts as double. So now the tier set is going to help build towards that Cold Front damage, outside of just casting Frostbolts and Flurries at the target. Now that you're integrating Lances into it, as well as the Splinters themselves, you're now finding ways for you to be able to add additional damage from those Splinters against the target to stack up Cold Front a little bit faster. However, direct damage from Splinters only has a 25% chance to grant you a stack of Cold Front, so it definitely does not stack as consistently as what we have for the Arcane Mage, which is a little unfortunate. The force reads, when Frozen Orb deals damage to 1 or more enemies, it has a 50% chance to grant a stack of Cold Front. When Cold Front summons a Frozen Orb, increases your spell damage by 10% for 10 seconds. So the idea is you want to proc and force the Cold Front as quickly as possible, right? You want to try to get as many frozen orbs as you can to stack up Cold Front, to then get a free frozen orb from Cold Front in order to increase your spell damage by 10% for 10 seconds. And just like Arcane Mage, when it comes to pure single target, this build and playstyle and the tier set is very hard to wrap your head around. Right now there's two variations of this build, and nobody really knows exactly the correct way to play it. Normal Mage playstyle includes using things like Frostbolt as the last ditch effort when there's nothing to do. Otherwise you press any button that lights up, like Flurries or Lances or Frozen Orb or Glacial Spike or Comet Storm or any number of other abilities that will just be higher priority. You're sending out Frozen Orbs pretty regularly, and using Splinters allows you to get the cooldown reduction on your Frozen Orb, so you would think that all these tools together would give you enough procs of Cold Front in order to be able to play the Mage passively how you normally would, but just get more procs. However, because of the normal way to play Frost Mage, you actually get very low uptime on your Force set because you're not able to get 30 stacks of Cold Front as quickly. However, one little awkward adjustment in rotation can fix the tier set completely, and that is not pressing Ice Lance. Just press Frostbolt, Flurry, and Glacial Spike whenever it's up, as well as any of the other big abilities, but it doesn't really matter. For the most part, to make the tier set work and actually do significant damage so you can have better uptime of your Force set spell damage amp, plus also more Frozen Orbs from your Force set to then feed into more of those Cold Front stacks, you just spam Frostbolt, ignore Ice Lance, and by itself, that's an awkward rotation change, because every mage uses Ice Lance as a rotational button. It is a higher priority. There's so many talents that synergize off of Lance, but to make the tier set work well, you will actually have to ignore the button completely, which means you may have to cadaver a build that's all about spamming Frostbolt and barely invest into Lances, which is a core component of the spec. However, just like Arcane Mage, as soon as you take this playstyle into AoE, it starts to make a lot more sense. Just being able to reset Frozen Orbs and having more regular Frozen Orbs thanks to Blizzard resetting the cooldown of Frozen Orb, you're actually able to build up the stacks of Cold Front in AoE a lot more regularly. Those extra Lances and Flurries that you sent out that will proc Splinters also help contribute towards more stacks of Cold Front, allowing you to focus on that cleave damage, lance damage, while still regularly building those Cold Fronts thanks to more uses of Frozen Orb. In AoE, you don't need to be cleaving down with Frostbolts in order to build up those stacks. Instead, you can just play the Mage normally and you'll be getting more stacks more naturally. So that's yet another example of the tier set that feels so good and so smooth to play in AoE, but so incredibly awkward and weird and unusual and not quite right in single target. And they've done that both for Frost and Arcane. And at this point, I think something is probably going to change in the future, hopefully. It would be very, very sad if this came out as is, because it makes Spellslinger feel not really playable, at least in certain content, just not really viable of a pick. Even if the tier sets were tuned numerically well, it just wouldn't really feel super great, at least in pure single target situations. A couple of things I think need to change. Either they need to rework the tier set altogether and change it to a completely different mechanic or some kind of a different setup, or make it work off of different talents altogether. Or two, they'll need to make adjustments towards the Cold Front talent as well as the Arcane Harmony. Like Arcane Harmony being able to stack past 20 potentially, but get the intuition at 20, I think that would be a pretty decent fix all on its own and would feel fairly smooth, while also making the talent actually probably potentially in some cases a little bit stronger. With the talent of Cold Front, I see what they were trying to go for. I think they were trying to encourage a way for you to get more Frozen Orbs as a Frost Mage. However, I think Cold Front as a talent just isn't that popular with the community. A lot of players talked about how it just doesn't feel that great to play unless in very key situations, and making a cornerstone talent for your tier set doesn't feel that good. And historically, Cold Front used to be a good talent for certain situations, but most of them being primarily AoE, where in single target it hasn't really felt that good. As it stands, the talent kind of ignores a good portion of your Mage's kit, causing you to really focus on Frostbolts and Flurries in order to get more Frozen Orbs, but Lances, Glacial Spikes, and ways for you to be able to spend Icicles in general also do exist in the game. But the talent itself as it stands, unless it is meant to be that you are to run with this talent and ignore certain procs to go for more Frost bolt damage, maybe that's an intentional mechanic, who knows really, but it just doesn't feel quite as cohesive as it could be. And I think that now could be a great opportunity to change up Cold Front so that it synergizes better into that entire Mage kit that could potentially become a powerhouse of a talent if it could be procced from other effects like Ice Lances and other procs, encouraging the Mage to play correctly while also feeding it with more Frozen Orbs. It could potentially be very, very good talent. It just would need to be adjusted. That, or they need to change Spellslinger talent or tier set to work off of another talent entirely. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm crapping on the devs and their ideas. I'm sure they had some sort of a set vision for how they wanted their mages and Spellslinger to play in the future, but as it stands right now, many players are not really feeling this tier set. Even if it was tuned well numerically, it just wouldn't really feel all that good or fun to play with. But they made changes for other hero specs like the Dark Ranger Hunters recently, and they made the playstyle much better, so hopefully the same attention can be dedicated towards Spellslinger mages as well, as the community actually has a lot of details and detailed reports and written write-ups and comments left all over the place as to what they could do to make it feel better or play better. But with that, that's a long video, so with this, I want to thank you all so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community, especially if you want to keep up with any of the new class changes or major updates for the patch 11.2. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.